Excellency, Mr. Bataina, I think we're on time, so if you want to take us and to start, we're at your discretion, sir.
Excellent. Well, I just want to start by saying good afternoon to our guests from Jordan and the region, and good morning to those joining us from the United States. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special session. I'm honored to be with you together with our distinguished speakers to consider some of the opportunities and challenges facing Jordan's services industry within a specific context of the Jordan-US economic relations. We are joined online by many business persons, CEOs of some of Jordan's leading companies, as well as professionals and policymakers. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing from you in our discussion session. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, this seminar is the 6th event held to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the US-Jordan Free Trade Agreement, which happened on the 17th of December 2001. We hope that these informative activities will contribute to deepening Jordanian-American business partnerships. This year, and with the support from the USAID MEG project and working with our local partners under the National Tijara Coalition, we are implementing a number of targeted technical assistance activities to grow exports and attract investments. Allow me here to extend our thanks to USAID and our colleagues at the US Embassy in Amman. I also wish to thank the members of the National Tijara Coalition, led by Her Excellency Engineer Maha Al-Ali, Minister of Industry, Trade and Supply, and the heads of the Jordan Chambers of Industry and Commerce for their continued support and dedication. I also wish to thank AmCham Jordan's member and partners and our sponsors. Without their commitment and belief in our mission and support to our work, we would not be able to continue to serve the Jordan-US business community now for more than 20 years. At this moment in time, allow me to recognize our sponsors. And today's seminar is sponsored by Crystal, a business process outsourcing BPO provider designed to unlock your business potential while enhancing customer relationships and brand perception. I would like to invite you to watch a short video to introduce you to our sponsoring company. Please go ahead with the video if you can.
An out-of-this-world experience inspired by a range of stellar services that include customer support, sales and marketing, research and data management, intelligence, training, and back office. Supported by our core values: transparency, flexibility, professionalism, excellence, innovation. We'll help your company make its quantum leap and soar towards the sky. Cristel, your trusted outsourcing partner.
Okay, thank you, Cristel. Honored speakers and dear guests, the economy of Jordan is dominated by the services sector that contributes to over 60% of the GDP, and it employs more than 70% of the total workforce. Enhancing the competitiveness of Jordan's services industry is crucial for the development of the national economy and to help in the post-COVID recovery plan. Today, Jordan, with its young, educated, skilled, and creative population, supported by its open and connected economy and enabling business environment, is poised to fully exploit its potentials and deepen economic integration regionally and with the US towards sustainable economic growth and prosperity. We are very privileged to have with us international leaders in the services sectors to share their perspectives and insights. So first, I would like to welcome Your Excellency, Mr. Hamid Mamdouh, Senior Counselor at the Kings and Spalding LLP based in Geneva. As a short introduction of His Excellency, Mr. Mamdouh is a former director of the Trade Services and Investment Division at the WTO. He was also responsible for legal affairs in the area of trade and in services. During the Uruguay round negotiations, his responsibilities included legal matters relating to the negotiations and the drafting of the General Agreement on Trade and Services GATS. His previous positions in the GATS include Assistant to the Deputy Director General of GATT and Legal Advisor on GATT Dispute Settlement. Prior to that, he was a trade negotiator with the Diplomatic Service of Egypt. Mr. Hamid, the floor is yours. We would like to talk about, of course, and here you talk about developments in international trade and services and opportunities for Jordan. Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. Bataina, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to address you today on such an interesting and exciting occasion. As you rightly mentioned, and I will start with your point about the importance of the services sector in the economy, Jordan is, like many other developing countries, also like my home country of origin, Egypt, countries who have a well-educated workforce and have a dynamic view of their market-based economies do actually hold the services sector very dearly as a backbone for economic and social development. The importance of the services sector, as you rightly said, is not just about the share in GDP, which ascends, as we know, with the level of development of the economy, but it's also the strategic importance of the services sector as providing inputs for all other productive activities. And the absence of a sound and dynamic, effective services sector actually hurts other sectors in the economy. The example that I repeat so often is my home country, Egypt. No, not many people actually know that Egypt last year, I think, was number 6 worldwide in producing fresh vegetables, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. But somehow that tremendous production capacity is not reflected in Egypt's export performance. The question of why is this the case is answered by the fact that the services chain between the tomatoes grown on the field and having the tomatoes actually landing on the shelf of a supermarket is just a chain of services that need to be provided in the most efficient, dynamic, and cost-effective way. So the importance of the sector strategically for the overall competitiveness of the economy cannot be overemphasized. Now, of course, it's not just about the economy, it's also about the society. And services, as we know, is the determinant of the quality of life in societies. Now, what have been the developments over the past 20 years? And I take the past 20 years because this is not just the time frame of the bilateral agreement between Jordan and the US, but it's also the sort of time frame in which we can look at Jordan's membership in the WTO and Jordan's adoption of a regime for trade and services. Now, globally, a lot of developments have happened over the past 20 years, and the most significant of them, and I would count mainly 4 elements here. The first is that the process of autonomous liberalization of services trade has been actually advancing in leaps and bounds. Countries have been autonomously liberalizing. Why? Because out of enlightened self-interest. It's in their interest. Why? Because your productive sectors need services, and if they're not produced efficiently and competitively domestically, then you import them exactly the same way we import intermediary products. The second development is technology. Technology has advanced in leaps and bounds, resulting in innovative business models, we look at the area of digital trade and we see wonders today. Now, so often policymakers in governments do not actually see that what we call digital trade is actually 95% trade and services. The services agenda is what is being considered when we talk about digital trade today. So technology is playing a tremendous role in producing those innovative business models which have changed the face of economies. And the third point is that this innovation has actually led to increasing flows of foreign direct investment, because the importance of services globally is also that when we look at global FDI flows and global FDI stock today, 2/3 is in services. 2/3 of global FDI flows and FDI stock is in services. This is according to UNCTAD's World Services Report of last year. So the impact on FDI flows has been tremendous. And then finally, another development over the past 20 years, which also emanates from those factors, is the regulatory response. The increasing tide of regulatory interventions by governments, which is something that we see very, very clearly in the area of digital trade, where regulators are struggling to address the new challenges that they are confronting as a result of those innovative business models. That's why we see a lot of tensions arising between economies with respect to regulatory interventions, which all the time are actually because of legitimate policy objectives, whether it's the protection of privacy or protection of cybersecurity or online consumer protection, or the policy objectives are multiple. But the regulatory response has been problematic. Why? Because we don't have international standards to what constitutes an appropriate level, an appropriate means, for example, of protecting individual privacy. So these are all developments that have resulted in so many trends developing over the past 20 years. And then to top all that, what really added a new dimension to all those developments recently was COVID-19 and how it affected the process of digitalization. In other words, the accelerated digitalization that we have seen over the past year is something that we could never have imagined. What we would have expected to happen in 20 years of progress on the digital trade front happened in the first 6 months of COVID-19. Now, what does that mean for the services community, be it on the business side or being on the government policy and regulatory side? It resulted actually in reactions of a mixed nature from governments. The most immediate reaction that affected services was restricting the movement of persons, restricting travel. And all of a sudden we see that COVID-19 has affected services sectors in a very uneven way. Some sectors were actually affected extremely negatively. All the sectors that depend on travel and the movement of natural persons, be it for leisure, tourism, for example, or business travel. And other sectors that relied on digital models have actually thrived, be it distribution, be it professional services of different kind, business services, an increasing trend of outsourcing. So we see that COVID-19 has provided a shake-up of previous models of services trade that we have seen. Now, all that, if we look at the picture and all those sort of mixed elements, we come to the next question of, okay, how did we deal as international community? How did we deal with this? On the negotiating table, when we were negotiating services trade liberalization, be it multilaterally in the WTO or regionally through bilateral or regional agreements. In the WTO, unfortunately, the picture is not very positive. What we have seen is a stalled negotiations in the Doha round, which started in 2001. Actually, the Doha round started just a couple of weeks before the Jordan US FTA entered into force. Unfortunately, the Doha round stalled, and 20 years later today, it's in my view, it's immaterial to talk about whether the Doha round is dead or whether it's alive. I think I would say it has certainly lost the will to live, because a negotiating agenda after 20 years would need to be revisited, because it's a different world today. And it's a different world not just because we have China as a main player on the international trade stage, but it's a different world because the world has evolved in many ways, not the least what I've described in terms of technology and digitalization and all that. But having said that, about the past 20 years in the WTO, we also have a glimpse of hope of a revival of the negotiating function of the WTO in the form of what is called the Joint Statement Initiative negotiations, which were launched at the last ministerial in Buenos Aires, the 11th ministerial. And here we have a very big negotiation taking place on e-commerce, another one on investment facilitation, a third one on services domestic regulation. But those joint statement initiatives are plurilateral negotiations that are, of course, they're open to all members, but not all members of the WTO are participating in these negotiations. And they're causing challenges by some conservative members of the WTO, like India and South Africa, who question the legitimacy of these negotiating projects because they're not agreed to by consensus by the 164 members. That's another conversation that I think would need to take place in the WTO with a lot of goodwill and political courage. And we hope that by MC12 we will see some more clarity about how this is going. But if I may say something about those negotiations in brief, that is important for policymakers and their vision about how do we address negotiations on services, be it multilateral or be it plurilateral or regional or even bilateral. I think and I believe we need to focus on the interface between trade liberalization and market opening on the one hand, and on the other hand, the legitimate regulatory sovereignty that governments need to protect in order to pursue legitimate national policy objectives. The examples I gave with respect to privacy and online consumer protection and cybersecurity and all that, and even national security, all these are legitimate objectives. But the challenge for trade negotiations, and whether it's in the WTO or elsewhere, is going to be more and more about how do we make sure that regulators, while they go about their objectives in a way that is not intruded upon, how while they're doing that, we get them to use the least trade restrictive means to achieve their objectives. It's what I would call the challenge of least trade restrictiveness. And this is going to lead to a lot of complex conversations between different government agencies. It's a multidisciplinary challenge that requires participation from different angles, but it is a challenge that I think would need to be addressed if the negotiating agenda is going to go forward. Now, the last thing I wanted to say was about regional agreements, and this is where you will come to the the relevance of the U.S.-Jordan bilateral treaty in a very significant way. And here, I would say we need to distinguish between bilateral and regional treaties and the multilateral negotiations, the multilateral framework that we have in the WTO. And we need to keep in mind some important distinctions, one of which is that by definition, bilateral trade agreements, preferential agreements, are expected to go way beyond the level of obligations that we have multilaterally. Point number one. Point number two is that so often those bilateral agreements are not just about trade. They're about, they're aiming at deeper levels of economic integration and sometimes regulatory coherence as well. So we expect more from those agreements, more than simply trade liberalization. The third point is that those bilateral agreements and regional agreements are also very, very useful when it comes to regulatory cooperation. The area of regulatory cooperation is going to be of increasing importance because of the increasing complexity of regulations that we talked about, whether it's about privacy, whether it's about recognition of regulatory standards for banking or for professional services. And it's not just about mutual recognition of regulatory standards, it's also about facilitating cooperation between regulatory agencies. Now, the fourth point is that those regional trade agreements, so like CPTPP, for example, or USMCA, are usually very, very effective incubators for innovative solutions for trade policy problems. They provide solutions that could be inspiring even for bilateral agreements that would be subject to updating. You might wish to update some of the provisions in your bilateral agreements in a way that further facilitates trade, facilitates cross-border and cross-jurisdictional trade. And this is very important for services because of the regulatory interface that I was talking about. Now, the other thing also that we need to keep in mind is that bilateral agreements or regional agreements have a very different legal architecture from multilateral agreements. So you would have, for example, a cross-cutting chapter in a bilateral agreement on investment that applies across the board to all investment sector services and non-services equally. However, in the WTO, you have limited disciplines that apply to FDI and services only when it comes to how you treat service suppliers of other members. Now, why am I saying this? Because so often negotiators fall into the trap of simply transplanting concepts from bilateral and regional agreements into a multilateral negotiation without carefully looking at the different legal architectures. The final point I would say here is that we should look at bilateral agreements and regional agreements and multilateral frameworks like the WTO as complementary to each other and not as in competition with each other, not as substitutes. And this is the conceptual basis for the WTO rules that apply to preferential agreements, that they are desirable because they are complementary in furthering the cause of trade liberalization. Now, with that, I have to apologize for speaking a bit longer than what I intended, but thank you very much once again for this wonderful opportunity, and congratulations on your 20th anniversary. And please don't hesitate to come back to me with questions on any of the points that I mentioned or any other points that you wish. Thank you. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Hamid Bey. There's absolutely no need for an apology. And we really thank you for your valuable insights. At this moment, please, if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Louis Rubalcaba. Sorry, yeah, again, Dr. Rubalcaba is also an expert sorry, Dr. Rubalcaba, of course, is a professor of economics at the University of Alcalá in Spain. I'm sorry, am I coming through? I'm having my microphone is coming in and out. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay.
But,
Okay.
if you want to gather your thoughts, I just want to tell everybody that after we hear the speakers, we're going to have a session just for questions and answers, like a panel discussion. So just, I know a lot of you have questions for Mr. Hamid, so save them because we're going to have an open dialogue at the end. So thank you. Sorry, Excellency, please.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you for that, of course. Again, Luis Rubalcaba is also an expert and advisor for international organizations such as the World Bank Group, where he was private sector development specialist for the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice. He has also been offering expert advice and policy reports for the OECD, the UN, and the IDB. Previous positions include Fulbright Schumann Scholar at Boston University, Distinguished Professor at VTT Tekes, Finland, Honorary Scholar at the University of Birmingham. And previously, he has been Policy Officer for the European Commission in Luxembourg and Brussels. Dr. Rubalcaba, the floor is yours, and we're anxious to hear about competitiveness of Jordan's services sector. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, it's a pleasure really to be here, and I really thank you for this very kind invitation to participate with all other the distinguished speakers as well. As Professor Mahadurar, really I like a lot your presentations that I get inspiration now for some of the things I'm going to tell. And really it's well, as maybe, I don't know if it's good or not, but as professor, I will try to give you some evidence on some data as on the situation of competitiveness. Sorry, I have now, there is a sound here. Should I mention, no, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but there is a noise somehow.
Okay, there is a noise. Lana is kind of, I have a call, from, I don't know, I'm going to.
Sorry, my mistake. I wanted to invite you to send to turn on your PC. So turn on your camera.
Yeah. And now I'm just trying to see about
Should be okay now. Should be okay. Thank you.
I have a presentation, so let's try to plug the presentation. But where is this one? It's not this one. Okay. I have several presentations here. Sorry, I don't know how to upload now the presentation.
I can share your presentation, but let me know when you want me to flip to the next slide.
Yeah, let me check. Sorry, I thought that I could share my presentation more easily.
Yeah,
but
I can help you out. We can share it from our side if you like, and we'll flip as you go.
Now I got it. I think I got it.
You got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I got it now. Sorry, I don't know. That's kind of mistake here. Can you see now? Yes, can you see the presentation?
Yes, it's downloading.
Yes, now we can. Now it's downloading.
Okay, good. Sorry for this. Let's see. Let's hope it works now. So my idea is just to present some brief results on what could be called competitiveness of services in Jordan. Of course, this is a very draft attempt to measure something that is very important. It's not a full diagnosis, a complete diagnosis on what is the situation of the competitiveness in services in Jordan, but just to give you some flavor of what I think are the key messages that are supporting what the previous speaker was already telling us. No, with some data based on the latest evidence from the World Bank, the WTO, and the OECD statistics, and also okay, which are the key messages supporting some of the previous analysis. And also the idea is to give you an insight of what we prepared kind of 10 years ago as part of the Jordan Service Development Master Plan that I work at JETCO with Lana Nimri and other colleagues in Jordan. I was living in your country for 3 months, and I had a really wonderful experience there. And we developed under the Modernization of Service Industries program funded by the European Union, and then with the at JETCO, having JETCO as the instrument agency. So we developed a very nice program there at that time, and with the diagnosis of which is the competitiveness of the services industries in Jordan. So I'm going to just give you here a summary of what we what we did last time, even if this should be updated, must be updated sooner or later. But I think many of the things are still valid 10 years later. No? And I will conclude with some policy ideas or implications from the previous results. So first, I would like to start about the data, but also the chairman, your chairman, you were also telling at the very beginning of the session, that the services in Jordan are very important. I remember that we drew this graph, yes, 10 years ago was a bit shocking that Jordan was the only country was in green color. That means that there were a lot of services at that time. That green meant the service importance in the economy. So as well as in most European countries, while in many countries the colors are red, yellow, gray, or orange. It means industry and agricultural economies. This was 2008. But it was clear that at that time Jordan was clearly a kind of exception in between the other countries in the region because the strong importance of service economy in there. But this is at the same time a paradox, because then we identified also a lot of weaknesses, a lot of things that needed attention, and then that's the reason there is kind of Jordanian paradox in the sense that, okay, the overall role of service in the economy is similar to those of the European economies, but the quality of the composition is not the same. So this is a little bit what we could call the Jordan paradox concerning services. Now, with more recent data, the picture is more or less the same. So you can see here how well Jordan has more or less the same level of services, much more level of services than the other MENA countries in the region, and is even a bit higher than the Latin American region, so a little bit below than the European countries. So it's true that the amount of services in the country is really huge, given this international comparison. So that's really interesting. And even if we look also at other data, for example, about the trade balance, the difference between export and import, we can see also that even the balances can be positive in some Jordan services, which is higher than in other regions in relative terms. But this is also interesting. That also gives an idea of the potential. But of course, this is all because we consider services at aggregated level. If we go more in a more disaggregated level, we found this here. What is the explanation of the paradox, of the Jordan paradox on services? The real explanation is that the importance of tourism and travel in the country is huge. And that's the reason, for example, this data represent market shares in terms of exports. So the percentage of exports of Jordan exporting services against the whole world. So which is the percentage of exports in the total exports in the world. So that means that the numbers are little, of course, because it's as corresponding to the size of the country. But what is interesting here is that what you can see in the orange bar, that really that's travel. So all data about services at macro level are very biased by the fact that travel is huge in relative terms in the country, much higher than in other regions or in other countries, like in the MENA countries in the region. You can see that travel is not that important. This is one factor. And the other factor is that these other business services, including other business services that is represented by the gray bar, they have really a small percentage in the total export. So the market share is very, very little at that time, and even not only little, but even decreasing over time from 2010 to 2019, which is the latest year with available data. You can see that there is a decreasing trend. So perhaps our sponsor of this session, Crystal, they can tell us about, because they experts on this kind of other services, you know, BPOs, all these things are really most of the new innovative services or the e-services and digital services that we have been talking before are here, are in this gray bar about other business services. And we can see that even if the country has good companies, very good companies like Crystal and others, but still the amount of the market share in these sectors is still very, very limited. And this is compared to the MENA countries, the difference is noticeable. No, it's really in the MENA countries, travel and other business, other services, exports, the competitiveness is more or less the same. While here the difference between travel and other services is huge. No, so and then if you consider also, moreover, you look at the right picture representing Europe, and you see that in Europe, what really Europe is important in travel. You have France, you have Spain, and my own country. You have countries in which travel is very important. You have, you know, and now we are suffering a lot of the COVID crisis because we are perhaps too travel and tourism oriented country. But even so, the market share is much higher in other services in Europe in general, not that much in Spain, but in Europe is much more important, the market shares in other services than in travel. It's important because it's a little bit the same trend that you look at also the Central and Southern Asia. But you can see that these countries in the Asia continent, they are really trying to improve their competitiveness through manufacturing or through industrial manufacturing or through this kind of new services that are beyond travel and transport, that are the traditional categories for services exports. So it's important to see that these are the trends. This is the facts in Europe, the facts also in emerging Asia. While Jordan the structure is more or less similar to Latin America, so this sense, for example, no, in these relative terms. So that means that there is a huge potential. This is not bad news. I think this is good news because that means that there is a huge potential to develop all these other services in Jordan. For me, this is the first message I would like to convey here, that the potential is huge because we can expect at least to have a similar amount of exports in the country as in other MENA countries, for example. So I think this can be good news in this way. No, here again, this next figure, you see that the new services, those digital services, also we can measure their competitiveness of these particular top services. Digital services, the new services today, we can measure them exactly the same way as the percentage of exports each country is selling regarding the total exports in the world. So the market share of exports. We do exactly the same measure here to measure competitiveness. And you can see this is exactly the same year, is 2019. You can see that in Jordan is not very high and is decreasing again. So there is maybe, well, we may have some statistical update issues here because I remember that sometimes perhaps the latest year will maybe revise in the coming time. But anyway, what is clear is that again that there is a huge potential here. You can compare to MENA countries. So the MENA countries, the evolution is more positive, and there is a huge margin to develop more digital service in the country. So I think this is
we have a question from our attendees. They want to understand what are the services you are talking about exactly. So I don't know if you can maybe talk for a minute and we can explain to them how data collection in the services sector is limited to the big four: travel, tourism, and the other services. So we don't have really data. And what do you mean by digital data?
Well,
Maybe you can
this is,
explain
yeah.
that so everybody's on the same page. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you, Lana. It's welcome. No, the idea is that this data come from the World Development Indicators, or from the World Bank, and this is the concept that it covers more or less what is the IT related services, mostly, not only, but IT related services. So the services provided by Crystal should be here, should be recorded here. That means that, of course, this is the all aggregated. So perhaps the trend saw it by Crystal and other Jordanian companies is the opposite. It's very high, increasing. They are doing surely excellent behavior in the global markets. But as the sector, I mean, it's not just BPOs and KPOs and all these things. It's also all other kind of exporting of services trade. So all services trade that are related to IT. Basically, it's mostly related to IT. I'm not so sure other categories which are included, but of course the main one is the IT-related services, like computer-related services, all what is related services, of which one section is the BPOs, etc. But it's only one section.
Yes. So can you explain why it's declining through the years? And I should say that this decline is not only affecting digital. If you go to the ITC data, we show a decline in all export of services for Jordan. But we have a question, same question, asking why is it declining, do you think?
Well, I really don't know. I see that there is a declining trend. Well, I know, I can imagine. I know that you see in Asia, for example, in Asia, the increased amount of export and the gains in market share is huge. So I assume that since this is a market share, is a global market share, normally is not the fact that the country is exporting less. No. Is the fact that other regions are exporting much more. It's the same like when there is a declining trend in travel. It's not because travel is less important than before. And here is exactly the same. It's not that digital services are less important than 10 years ago in Jordan. No. This is not the case. Surely it is. And surely the gross amount means that these services are more important in Jordan now than 10 years ago. But if we compare to a global market share, to what other countries are performing, so the relative market share decrease. Why? Not because we are doing bad things in our country. No. It's because other countries are doing better than us. Maybe we are doing something good, but others are doing even better. This is a little bit the point, right? This is I don't know if it's clear now. But yeah. So it can be tricky. But we have to think about this data in terms of relatively data with respect to the world, to the overall world. So if other countries perform better, so you decrease. But maybe internal data, you are still increasing, right? But compared to other one, or to maybe Southern Asia, or for example, India, that has been traditionally one of the leaders, India, in IT services, in digital services, well, compared to India, or compared to the top leading economies in the US, or in some European countries, compared to what these countries are doing, okay, the gap between those leaders countries and Jordan is increasing. This is what you have to look at this graph only in this way, that the gap between the top leading countries in exports and the countries increasing. But maybe Jordan is doing well and is increasing, and so it's right. This is a little bit the way of interpreting this data. So, and finally, just, well, we could talk more about categories, about different things, but I would like only to give you some few data. One of the reasons why, maybe there are all these gaps, etc., is because we should pay attention to the regulatory aspect, not only to the regulatory aspect, but we are now in the context of, we are talking about the international free trade agreements, on preferential trade agreements, etc. So we need to talk about which can be the restrictions that there exists in the country that maybe may play a role affecting international trading services. So it's true that in the tertiary sector, if you look at this data coming from the OECD, the regulatory restrictiveness index places Jordan in a not very good position comparing all countries in the sample. No? You see all the countries. European countries are more or less with very little restrictions. Many of them on the left side of the graph, while on the right side you have some countries in which restrictions are really very important. So regulatory restrictions are a problem, but I can tell you that also it's not necessarily sometimes the only factor that is that explain, or even the main factor explaining problem in the sector, because there are some exceptions. For example, in the Philippines, they are doing very well in now exporting a lot of IT services, while they still have some restrictions. But also it's important not to look at this graph as the general picture for all services sector, but I advise you to look at the OECD data, the daily data, and you will see that there are a lot of differences. For example, communication data, communication services. In communication services, the restrictiveness index for Jordan is not bad. Is really Jordan is pretty well. The behavior of Jordan in communication services is not affected for many restrictions. So, but if we look, for example, on hotels or travel, or then you identify certain things here and there that they may explain some gaps in developing the potential for services exports, or other business services in particular. So it's important, again, not just to stay here, stick to the overall graph for the overall services, but to go into the detail for each service. The situation can be different, and the restrictiveness is not just the amount of the restrictiveness affecting a given sector, but also the quality and the impact of the restriction can be even more important. So I just would like just to give you now, after this data, an insight of what was the summary at that time that we did for under JETCO for this European program, that we did a kind of SWOT analysis for the competitiveness of Jordanian services in the world. So the strengths were about the political stability and international openness in the country. There are some strong services sectors in the areas that we identify related to travel, to ICT, to some business services, like Crystal here represented, and health, for example. We also discovered that another strength is the hospitality and open culture, the high degree of qualified people, such as engineers and doctors, and the good performance, loyalty, and positive values of workers in many sectors. I think we identified those as the key pillars for explaining the competitiveness, the good competitiveness of Jordan in many services areas. But there are also some weaknesses that explain the other way around, why Jordan is not more competitive than it could be. For example, the lack of knowledge-intensive services, and now we could say digital services, what we were talking before. This is a factor. Together to the sluggish productivity gains that is sometimes related, because a way to increase productivity, also in manufacturing, as I remember now on Hamid, the tomato cases from Egypt. So also there is a lot of knowledge-intensive services that if they are competitive enough, they can really push competitive productivity gains in all sectors using those services. So this is very important, and this is a weakness when there is no strong competitive knowledge-intensive services, or not strong enough. There are some competitive, but it could be more. No? The idea. And then, so these issues on quality, innovation, the mismatch between supply and demand in labor markets, lack of entrepreneurship and business culture, regulatory environment. Here we mentioned at that time low profit from international liberalization trade agreements. So that means that there was kind of a pity that the agreements were not used in a way that it could be exploited better in order to promote more flows, exports in the country, and then access to finance, venture, and risk capital. So these were kind of the main weaknesses that we identified at that time. So opportunities, well, many opportunities. We really thought that in terms of knowledge-intensive services, ICT, creative industries, very important, creative industry, digital economy, Jordan can make a difference. Can be really a kind of hub, really for a lot of transitions between the region, the MENA region, the Arab, let's say, let's put also the Arab language based countries, and for example, Western economies in Europe. So this kind of link that Jordan may play, this bridge role that Jordan may play between let's say Europe and the Arab world and MENA region in general, it's also a potential for many services that we found that time, business services and also audiovisual services, creative services, and of course travel as well in some aspects of the travel and tourism as well. So and for FDI, we identified also huge potential there. Threats, well, there are countries offering lower prices and salaries. There are emerging economies with high competitiveness. We also identify, for example, that in the area of medical travel, that Jordan was really huge, but at that time, and then was losing because of the Gulf countries were also serving this kind of some similar kind of service. So for each of the subsectors, we could just prepare a different SWOT, no? But it's important again to say that there is a huge potential so the Jordan can be much more competitive that it is now. It's not the fact that it's not competitive. There is a lot of competitiveness now in the services in Jordan, like for example in travel, but also in some business services and some other services. But there is a huge potential to increase this competitiveness to another layer, to another step. Policies. I really think that I conclude with, okay, I fully agree with the messages from the previous speaker, Noam Hamid, because really many of the things I fully concur with him. I think that in services it's very important, in particular for Jordan, to understand the complementarity between international trade and FDI. These two things are really go hand by hand. They cannot be just promoted one without promoting the other, because in many services, in the strongest services economies in the world, for example, India was so strong and leading economy in ITC services because they were promoting at the same time FDI, a lot of FDI and a lot of exports and imports as well, exports and imports both. So these complementarities need to be really promoted when thinking about policies, also free trade agreements. And I really am not going to repeat what the previous speakers had said. I fully agree. Just also to tell you that it's also important to understand the kind of what I call a cluster approach. The services are not just isolated activities; they are integrated activities in the whole production system. For example, I remember we draw at that time of our strategy at JETCO. We draw some clusters. For example, this is the health and medical cluster for medical travel, and we discovered that we could not just promote one mode in the international trade for medical travel if we would not promote the competitiveness of a set of full industry supporting that particular service, because that particular service is not just the hospital or the doctors. It's also the accommodation, it's the transport, many things around. So we want to focus on one sector. We need to broaden the scope to all other sectors that really converge in a single sector. So this is important, because sometimes when I see with some free trade agreements is that sometimes they are very segmented by particular areas. But so it's important to have tools and instruments that when we want to promote something, we need to just to help the full cluster around a particular service, and that's important. Now, here is the cluster for travel. Right? So it's huge. It's a lot of things that may happen in all these different activities in order to promote health travel, for example. And we could do the same for the IT, digital services, creative services, etc. And this is why liberalization policies, international trade and FDI policies need to be complemented with other policies as well, innovation or training, many other policies that may help also to boost competitiveness all over the country. And that's it. I stop here. I don't know if I also was too long, but well, I thank you for your attention. And of course, I'm ready for answering questions or whatever comment you want to tell. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Rubalcaba. Appreciate it. Now, if I may, I would like to welcome His Excellency Roberto Echandi. Dr. Echandi was the director of the Program on International Investment at the World Trade Institute, WTI, at the University of Bern. He was appointed ambassador to Costa Rica to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union. During the same period, Mr. Echandi was the chief negotiator of Costa Rica to the negotiations of the association agreement between the European Union and Central America. Let me see here. Okay, and then Roberto has also served as special adjunct ambassador for U.S. Trade Affairs and Costa Rica's lead negotiator in services and investment in the U.S. Central America Free Trade Agreement, the CAFTA, CAFTA. His Excellency also served as Director General for Trade, International Trade at the Ministry of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica and as legal advisor to the appellate body Secretariat of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Mr. Echandi is also a member of the faculty of the Masters in International Law and Economics at the WTI and of the Masters in International Economic Law at the University of Barcelona. A member of the editorial board of the Journal of International Economic Law, JIEL, and the Journal of the World Investment and Trade, JWIT. Sorry for that. Please go ahead, Roberto, the floor is yours. I know we're all excited to hear about the services and investment and how we can leverage these to support economic growth and job creation in Jordan. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and thanks to all of you to give me the chance to be with you today. I just want to double check if you can see the slides very quickly.
Yes, we can see the slides. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I will go more or less to the point. I have a presentation. I would like to, rather than present myself, I'm very humbled by the presentation of His Excellency, but I would like to talk to you today by a former colleague of yours. I come from Costa Rica. I was a negotiator of the U.S. Central America FTA in services precisely, and I come from a country that in 1996 we basically relied on coffee and bananas for our exports, 70% of our exports. Today, our main exports are services, precisely. We export more agriculture than before, but services have become the main source. And not only tourism, we're talking about high technology services, a lot of BPOs, and in very sophisticated areas. So I would like basically to focus my presentation on what do the private sector, people like you, how to maximize the potential benefits of these free trade agreements. And part of the problem, I had some introductory slides that I will pass very quickly because they basically reinstate some of the points of my previous colleagues. And it's basically that we have on services, we have a lot of challenges. And one of these is statistics, right? For a long time, because of the four modes in which services are exported, they have been measured differently, and up to 2018, the value of world trade, commercial and services was measured 5.63 trillion dollars, but that only covers certain modes of supply. If we measure all the modes of supply, we are reaching almost the same amount of trade that other the merchandise trade has. And as Hamid was saying, this is a graphic that shows Hamid's point. The cost of services affect the cost of manufacturing, right? And this is a graphic that shows you the weight of services in different, in like manufacturing, machinery, transport, metal products, metal, etc. And you see the type of services and the weight that they have. The gray, sorry, the light blue are basically distribution services. This is another graphic that shows a very important point that I would like to stress that Hamid already made. And is that when we think about trading services, a lot of people tend to think in endogenous terms. What do I mean by that? People tend to think that countries can only export what the nationals can produce. And that's not the case. Actually, as we will see, when we talk about services, we, just like in goods, when you have global value chains, in services, we also have global value chains. And the overwhelming majority of the services are traded via foreign direct investment. So this is a graphic that shows you in gray the percentage of cross-border trade that is delivered through FDI, which is mode 3. You see in blue mode 1, which is cross-border. You see in yellow mode 4, which is presence of natural persons, and consumption abroad, which is mode 2. You see an evolution here between 2005 and 2017 of that two conclusions. One, investment is actually the most important way of exporting services, but also that mode of supply is leading to cross-border transactions. So you see that the blue part is increasing. And as we will see, this has a lot to do not only with COVID, but COVID actually exacerbated a trend that is happening, and is that technology is enabling right now to what a lot of economists call arbitrage, right? Just like when you had in manufacturing and agriculture, multinationals moving away from their home countries to find specialization and to be able to export trading goods. And well, in services, it's happening the same, especially because now services, the people do not have to move away. So this explains, for example, how in Costa Rica, for example, Costa Ricans administer multinationals of like Procter & Gamble, like Intel, like Bank of America, like Hewlett Packard. All the operations between Canada and Argentina of those multinationals are done in Costa Rica. But that has been a combination of investment that came to Costa Rica to hire nationals and to work with national firms, generating a cluster, the clusters that Luis was talking about, to move the needle and transform the export supply of the country in terms of services. And this is extremely important because then at the end of the day, if you want to export services, yes, you have to help to internationalize your own firms, but the firms in small countries tend to be small. So they need to connect to bigger firms. And they also, if you want as a whole to generate more employment, you need competitive, you need a critical mass of exports moving the needle. And for that, FDI is absolutely key. FDI in services for cross-border supply. Now, the paradox is that despite all this importance of trading services tends to be the less understood and underestimated. I show you how the data basically doesn't do justice to the weight of services, is the less transparent. And this is a very, very important point. When a lot of you are asking why we're not exporting more. Well, because the barriers to trading services are hidden in laws and regulations, and they can be both horizontal laws or sector specific, and a lot of countries haven't even mapped where those barriers are. And those barriers can affect not only the exports of Jordanians, but can affect the inward investment in Jordan, for export-related trading services investment. They tend to be, the trading services, the most restriction. The trade liberalization in goods has gone much farther than trading services. And also the trading services, because they are highly regulated, as Amit was saying, they tend to be very more prone to be affected by red tape, regulatory heterogeneity, the laws and regulations among countries change. And because services are regulated also, that generates more, that the fact that they are more prone to conflict between private sector and governments. Let me tell you that most of the conflicts and disputes that happen between governments and private sector happens on services, and I will show you a very revealing data on that. Now, with the WTO, there was this exercise that World Bank did as well on measuring the trade costs in services. And just to back what I'm saying, look at the graphic. The areas, these are basically areas that affect the cost of doing trade in services is governance quality, trade policy barriers and regulatory convergence, and information and transaction cost. If we add that, we end with more than 50% of the cost. And this is extremely important. Why? Because again, the more data we know about what's going on, the more possibility private sector and governments will have to understand how to unlock that potential that is there. Now, this is a graphic that shows you the point that I was telling you. The majority of conflicts happening between investors, private sector, and governments tend to happen in services. And these conflicts are not menial. They're very important. Around 25%, listen to this, around 25% of all investment going into developing countries stops expanding or even withdraws because of lack of transparency and predictability in dealing with public agencies, sudden change in the laws and regulations with a negative impact of the company, delays in obtaining necessary government permits and approvals, restrictions to ability to transfer and convert currency, breach of contract, and expropriation. This graphic shows you see here that 11% of all the investors worldwide in developing countries cancel totally cancel, the withdraw the investment that that they have done in the countries. 14% withdraw plans, 27 delay. So this means that despite all the effort that a lot of countries do to attract investment, they are losing the investors that are already in the government. That are already in the country, already established. And the majority of these problems happen in services. Look, 55%. So all these are challenges that I'm sure that you're familiar with. I would like to basically talk about the work that we're doing in the World Bank on how then countries can maximize the potential benefits of a free trade agreement. And basically, there are many ways that a free trade agreement are key to foster or to unleash the potential that governments have for supporting the private sector. The first point is that to recognize that the ones that will generate exports are not the agreements, is the private sector itself. So you need to be actually or the governments have to have a very strong dialogue and engagement with you to foster complementary agendas, and I will develop that point, to how to support you maximizing the potential opportunities that you have. You need a favorable trade and investment policy ecosystem, but also, and this is the point that I wanted to also start, the FTA itself can help you to move all these other 3 points. And why? Well, because the FTAs foster discipline, have norms and disciplines that have to be complied with. Now, the signing of trade agreements is not tantamount to boost trade. I mean, it would be great if you can just boost export by signing papers. However, some trade agreements can perpetuate barriers or prevent trade from growing. And this is an important point because we just did in the World Bank a research that shows that only agreements with ambitious structure leading to complete transparency of where the obstacles are, minimum disciplines and enforceable disciplines affect exports significantly. And they can increasing exports trade by 15 or 65%. Depending on the context. And what are we talking about when we talk about the structure? Well, whether we use negative lists or positive lists, which is basically whether the agreements force governments to list where the problems are and list all the laws and regulations that are specifically becoming barriers to trade and investment, not necessarily to eliminate them, but to enable the private sector and the countries to talk about that and to see whether or not that specific barrier is the least restrictive that countries can have to pursue a legitimate public policy objective. Another important point is that some FTAs lead to very important rollback commitments. That was the case of the US-Jordan FTA. You undertook, when one looks at the text in the agreement, one can see that there were some important rollback commitments, that is elimination of some barriers that were there that were undertaken to be eliminated thanks because of the FTA. But also, most recent FTAs have what is called a horizontal standstill, which means that even though the whole liberalization and the whole change of regulations doesn't happen at the same time, at least there's a commitment not to make situations worse. And because of that, that leads to a listing of all the barriers. Then there's mechanisms that also can enable gradual opening at the pace that the country's parliaments decide. And this is what is called ratchet clauses. Later, if you are interested, we can come back to that. I just would like to give you kind of an overview of a key analysis that I did of the US-Jordan FTA. And this US-Jordan FTA, when you see the trading services provisions and the annexes, definitely was a key step, a very important step forward at the time for Jordan. In terms, it has a very broad coverage in terms of sectors, included important rollback commitments. Now, it's a positive list, right? And that's not bad per se, but that puts Jordan, in a way, in a disadvantage vis-a-vis other countries that negotiated with the US afterwards, where they included the negative list, the horizontal standstill, and the ratchets. Now, does it mean that you have to change your FTA? No. The good news is that there's no need to change the FTA to modernize it. You still can implement the agreement based in good practices. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, well, this is an example of the FTA that you have, and this shows certain very important restrictions that, even though we don't know, this is the text of the agreement, so we don't have, I don't know if the actual laws and regulations of Jordan still include these restrictions. However, based on this, we could elaborate that list of restrictions to see, A, whether they are still in place, and B, once you list it, to see whether they are less trade restrictive means in order to foster or the unlock the potential benefit of services. And I want to emphasize on FDI in services, because we were the other day comparing the cases of Costa Rica and Chile. Chile is, both countries are now in the OECD. Both countries have been very successful in leveraging international agreements, but the participation of Chile in services, GVCs, are very, very limited, while the participation of Costa Rica in GVCs are very high. So we were wondering why, and a lot had to do that in Costa Rica, the way that services have been boosted is through FDI and connecting the FDI with the domestic services suppliers, while in Chile, all the services exports have been focused only on domestic exporters, which tend to be small, which tend to be, yes, they are very important, but they do not move the needle when we talk to the total export basket. So why I'm telling you this? Because that means that if Jordan wanted to really boost and shift and really leverage FDI in services, there are some key restrictions that today prevent investment in services from happening, or at least you are sending the signals that you don't want investment. And that may explain also a key challenge. For example, this is the situation of real estate. In real estate, many countries have limitations for foreign ownership of land, so that's not a problem. But here, I underline here the lease of real estate. In the case of lease of real estate, but non-Jordanian firms, for more than 3 years is subject to cabinet approval. Now, cabinet approval may happen or not, but imagine if you are Intel, or if you are Amazon, or if you are a big company, Apple, whatever, and you want to set up, your facilities for the Middle East in Jordan, and you have to lease property. Well, if you have to go to cabinet approval, that seems a very weird signal, right? It can be very, very lengthy, can be politicized, it's not clear, it's not transparent. And remember that in the case of investment, this type of investment that is export oriented can choose where to go. So these companies go to the countries that are easier to set up, that are faster to set up. Because they don't need to be in Jordan. They could be in Turkey, they could be in Egypt, they could be in other countries as well. So this is a key point of the question that I want to raise. This is, to what extent the regulatory framework is making easier for you to leverage the potential of trading services. This is another example. I checked which sectors, based on the US-Jordan FTA, trading services annexes, which sectors had 50% or more foreign equity limitation in Jordan. That means that foreigners cannot own more than 50%, right? Sometimes it was even less. And I needed two slides to check all the sectors that are basically closed. Architecture, engineering, urban planning, rental, advertising, technical testing, personal placement, supply services personnel, energy distribution, photographic services, modern, even services like related scientific and technical consulting services that excludes sensitive areas like surveying, exploration, exploitation of map making. These sectors, basically, what it means is that you have a performance requirement. That means that if you have a big multinational that wants to go to Jordan to hire Jordanians, the only way that they can do it is only if 50% of the company is owned by Jordanians. So that my question that I wanted to leave to you is, what would happen if you have a huge multinational that that will make billions investment in Jordanian, and you don't have a Jordanian that is interested, or you don't have a Jordanian who wants to own the company, or moreover, how are you going to convince like Apple, okay, you can come to Jordan, but half of your company will have to be owned by us. Well, is that competitive? Is that a competitive proposition? I don't know. And then look at this. There's some that one can understand, but like, for example, look at this air catering or maintenance and repair of aircraft. So, for example, if Airbus wanted, or Lufthansa Technik wanted to go and invest in Jordan, they couldn't, because you would need to have a Jordanian 50% equity limitation. So this is this is food for thought. I don't know if you still have these restrictions in the laws and regulations, and that's why one of the key advices to start a serious dialogue with the government and the private sector is to convert those annexes in a negative list, not for negotiation, but for your own internal domestic discussion, and understand what are the laws and regulations that are having these restrictions, so you can then engage and use that to unveil and having a discussion law by law, and see whether or not they are still available, existing or not, whether these restrictions make sense or not. And if you do that, this is exactly the kind of information that your even investment promotion agencies will have to be involved, because at the end of the day, think about it. If you want to grow the services exports of Jordan and you want more FDI there, the first question that the FDI an investor will ask is, can I invest? Can I take it? And if I can't invest, then of course it's a no-brainer. Then you cannot do anything about it. The last point that I want to make, this is kind of the beginning to enable investment to happen, but we also are doing now a research on what have other countries done in order to maximize the use of FTAs. And this is what we call FTI complementary agendas. And this includes not only practices or good practices on how to administer the agreement that are usually done by the ministries of trade. That means, not only complying in execution of commitments, is basically to work with you, with private sector, on understanding what are the problems you're facing, and then helping you to export. monitoring and doing the analysis of what is working, what is not, where the sectors are being exported, which sectors are not exporting, are exports growing, are exports not growing, why? And then second, we know that the ministries of trade are not alone on this, especially in services. Many agencies are involved in the implementation of services commitment. So there's a second part is to work across agencies and provide implementation support, including investment promotion if you want to bring investment and coordinate it. And last but not least, what we call transition to free trade, which is the dialogue with you, with the private sector, to identify what you need in order to export more. What are the sectors with great potential? What are the everyday problems you face? What are the problems and sensitivities as well? What are the regulatory distortions affecting your competitiveness? And then what have other countries done in order to address those regulatory distortions? And then, of course, good practices on planning, executing that dialogue with you. That the dialogue for this to work, it cannot be a big forum with thousands of people. Sometimes, no, this has to be sector by sector in small working groups, taking notes, agreeing on agendas, and doing it. And then, of course, leveraging the export promotion programs and the foreign investment promotion to link that FDI with the international private sector. I just want to tell you that we, the World Bank, we're launching a program with Jordan precisely to begin to work in this direction. So we look forward to work with you on this exciting project. And the project is basically aims at assisting Jordan in how to better maximize the potential benefits of the FTAs that you already have. So I'll stop here and back to you, Lana.
Excuse me. There is a question. Can I ask or no?
I think we just want the chairman to wrap up, take us to the next. Now we're going to have a panel discussion and the chairman will moderate the session.
Okay.
Please, just housekeeping, if please raise your hand in the app so we can see who you are and direct the question to you.
Okay.
When you have the floor, please identify yourself, ask your question, and if you have it directed to a specific speaker or in general. So with that, Mr. Battani, please, the floor is yours, sir.
Yes, thank you, Lana. Appreciate it. Thanks for the point of order. I want to thank you really very much for your, for a very valuable presentation. If I may, although I agree with you on a lot of what you mentioned about the barriers and restrictions, I believe we need to check the latest changes or developments on the law. But the fact that you still see them there means that they're not being advertised enough. So I absolutely agree with you fully. We will start now the session on questions and answers. If I may ask, just start with the first question to our first presenter, Hamid Bey. And I was wondering how important is it for the Arab League to have a services agreement like the GAFTA, for example? And how do you see the reform of the WTO, in deepening services trade globally? Can you answer? Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very, very pertinent question because I think when we talk about regional integration and the opportunities that can be provided, it's so natural to look at the Arab region and look at the tremendous potential that countries like Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, those countries that do have tremendous services capacity in certain sectors would benefit, but also would benefit the rest of the region. And indeed, I did a report about a bit more than 3 years ago for the Arab League, specifically on how to give effect to the inter-Arab agreement on trade and services. The agreement is there. There are a limited number of countries have signed the agreement and submitted schedules. Jordan is one of them. The problem here, I think, is the lack of political will. And this is where I think it becomes more of a political question, but very strategically important, particularly for private sector organizations like yours, to raise the awareness of policymakers and raise their understanding of the services agenda and its importance. We talked now for the past hour and a half about how strategically important it is to strengthen the services sector. And we also talked about how important it is to have a competitive services market that leads to strengthening the domestic services capacity. Now, you need to implement all these sort of visionary ideas through policies and government actions. And that would be sort of my brave answer to your question. The problem really is lack of political will. The instrument is there, the agreement is there, but it is not being used. Now, let me just place this in a slightly broader context, because policymakers, not only in Arab countries, but in many other countries, including the big players of international trade, whether it's the US or the European Union or Canada or Japan or even China, are not actually focusing on how to strengthen international cooperation on trade, but focus on trade within the current modern understanding of trade, including trade and services. Still, a lot of policymakers are talking, when they talk about trade today, they only talk about merchandise trade, as if that's the only form of trade. So there is a lot of advocacy and a lot of awareness effort that needs to be addressed. This is the biggest problem, I think in my view, and we're facing it with the WTO reform issues as well, about which I would be more than happy to respond to questions. While I have the floor, may I just, first of all, commend my two colleagues for excellent presentations, really superb presentations. And I liked very much what they said, and I liked very much what Roberto said about services restrictions. The only thing I would add to that is that it is quite peculiar, actually, in the area of services, that restrictions are very subtle, and this is where the detailed understanding is important. I mean, Roberto's example of the national treatment limitation on real estate leasing was an excellent one. And it is excellent in my view, because it says approval is needed. You know, sometimes the restriction in services is not due to the presence of a measure, but sometimes it's due to the absence of an objective decision-making process that leaves a huge margin for discretionary authority. And in services, in anything that requires approval, this becomes a big problem. Now, this is where, again, the increasing awareness and insisting that policymakers need to understand better the objectives from services trade policy, but how to go about it also and implement the right instruments. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, very much for that.
We have I don't know if you can see them. We have two speakers with their hands raised. Can you see them?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we have two people with their hands raised, as Lana said. Let me start by Mr. Mohammed Mansour, and we'll follow it by Mr. Tariq Dawood. So Mohammed Bey, please go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Mohammed Mansour, a Jordanian lawyer and professor of law, joining from Abu Dhabi. I'm very, very delighted to be here with you. Thank you all for your rich insights. I have two comments. The first one is related to Mr. Mamdouh's talk, which indeed met our highest expectations regarding touching on services and high-tech services and regulatory schemes, services and COVID, and other issues related to various concerns, including privacy and sovereignty. So thank you so much, Mr. Mamdouh. Mr. Mamdouh shed some quick light on regionalism in services, something very close to my heart. I totally agree with you, Mr. Mamdouh. I'm very hopeful that the trend of racing to regionalism would be complementary to the multilateral trading system. But I am fearful that the stalled negotiation in the WTO on services would allow regional trade and services to dominate the scene at the expense of the multilateral system. I feel this is a legitimate concern, as we in Jordan or any developed nation are very much protected or shielded by the rules-based system of the WTO versus the political-based system of the regional trade. So my question to Mr. Mamdour, first of all, as a practitioner, as a scholar, as a former candidate to the position of WTO DG, is the following. How can we also maintain a sound multilateral trading system in services while everybody is racing toward regionalizing in trade, particularly in services? Can the WTO keep up with the speedy regional development in services? So this is for Mr. Mamdour. Just a quick note to Mr. Roberto Echandi. I totally agree with him about the hurdles that the Jordanian system offers to services. I can very quickly share my experience while negotiating an exploration agreement of uranium between the Jordanian government and the French government. Usually, the Jordanian government engages in what's so-called concession agreements to bypass the local regulations. So a concession agreement would be awarded to a foreign mega investor in order to enable the investor to bypass any local and legal requirements for investment in services. This is not sustainable. It is doable, but it's not sustainable if we want to attract the lower level in quantity and quality of the service sector. So I echo with what Mr. Roberto Echandi said. I totally agree with him that there is a lot of work that we should do in Jordan to foster our services capacity. Thank you so much again. And I look forward to hearing your comments.
Mr. Tara, would you like to ask your question? And then the panelists can answer the two questions and we'll take other comments after that. Mr. Tara Daoud.
Thank you, Lan. Thank you, everybody. This is Tariq Daoud, the Managing Director of TWEAK Consultation. And we have been in this market for more than 5 years, doing a consultation for a lot of investors here and there, especially from the GCC. Anyhow, I would like to just put something, and Mr. Hamid, I think he mentioned, it's the willingness of the government or the state, how to move things in the right way, or to put the regulations that helps such services. Anyhow, there was a lot of activities actually even supported by the USAID, like a physical reform and public financial management activity with abbreviation of FRBAFM. And this is a public-private dialogue actually. And it took like I think it's still going on. It started like 3 years back, but there is no results of this such dialogues. This is the problem, and it is not announced to public. So we are always in certain area, we don't know the status of such projects. It's missing, I would say. The activity is there, there's outputs, but there is no clearance of this, or there is no announcement of this public dialogue. And we know that the Ministry of Commerce also, they did like, partnership between private and public, and they called it like a union, I think, or partnership for, projects invested by private and public, both. But also this, it was so delayed because of the obstacle Mr. Robert, he mentioned maybe also, approvals regardless and in which stage actually. But there was a project of more than $5 billion, and nobody knows the status of it. I'm here just, Mr. Hamid, I think he mentioned, this is, he pointed clearly that there is the willingness. We come again and will be affected, any service provider, actually, if there is no clearance, no clarity, There is not even clear KPIs, I would say, for a lot of projects here and there from different things. And one of the things we missed maybe also, the services that belong to supply chain. You know, today, if you are moving to do a lot of services, increasing the services, then you have to have really the supply chain can give you a lot of services, creation of services through the supply chain, which we are really a country with 2 domestic airports. Still, we are doing transferring the goods through trucking, which is, ages we should move from this, There's a lot of obstacles. I don't know, is it because the private sector is not moving or the government? Mainly what I saw from the past experiences, that we have a major problem with the government directions. They don't want, or I don't know if they want, or frankly speaking, but I can assure you that mostly the private sector is impacted heavily because of the government regulators, And this is what we are facing. Supply chain is a major to do a lot of services, I would say. FDI, foreign direct investments, since we are every year increasing the taxes, there will be no more foreign investments. I assure you that, because we tried a lot to bring investors to participate in some projects in Jordan, and the major negative thing for the investor is the taxes. While I think Mr. Roberti didn't mention it clearly, that the taxes impacted negatively the FDI, the foreign direct investment. Jordan became one of the highest tax countries, within the region. So I don't know, the investment will be impacted, the services will be impacted, the whole private sector will be impacted. So I wanted to say this, and there is a public-private dialogue that's going on, and it was from years, but what the results? There is no results. So all these issues actually impacted the services, I would say. And thank you for listening to my comments. I have nothing more to say. Thank you.
Lana, do you want to take care of this, or do you want me?
No, I mean, it's for you. Of course, you should.
Okay, go ahead. Well, gentlemen, the floor is yours. We start with His Excellency Hamid Bey Mamdouh, and then we'll go on to probably Mr. Roberto Ishandi, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very good question that was put in the beginning by Mr. Nassour about the WTO and whether the WTO could actually perform its role, and whether the WTO can, and comparing that with the perspective of regional agreements and bilateral agreements. My answer to the first part of that question is that, of course, the WTO can, but not in its current shape. The WTO now is facing what I would call even an existential crisis. The 3 basic functions, the 3 vital functions of the organization, which is negotiation, dispute settlement, and the deliberative function, which I think is critically important, the 3 functions have broken down. Now, the leaders of the G20 for the past 5 years have been emphasizing the necessity of WTO reform. The problem starts, in my view, with the lack of leadership. We started this project of building a new multilateral trading system way back in the early and mid-80s. That's when I started. I joke about it, and I always say I was 12 years old at the time. But we started way back. Why? Because there was this leadership from a group of countries. The United States was in the forefront, saying that we need to reform the multilateral trading system, which was the GATT at the time. Now, Okay, why did we need to reform it then? Because the global trade realities have changed completely. We started thinking about services, protection of intellectual property. The GATT itself was not even an organization. It was an agreement implemented on a provisional basis. So we got into this process of negotiations in the Uruguay round, which resulted in the creation of the WTO. That was driven by leadership, and the leadership produced a blueprint of what that system should look like. And there was a reliable, serious process of negotiations that took into account the interests of all countries, including developing countries like Egypt and India and others. This is why we had, negotiations on textiles and agriculture and issues of interest to developing countries. The problem we have now, and we've been having since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, was that the US stopped its leadership role, took a back seat, and of course, you have a leadership vacuum. Now, that still persists until today. This is why, in spite of the leaders of the G20, every year in their final communique, the heads of states of the biggest 20 economies on the face of this planet talk about the necessity of WTO reform, but until today, and we have a ministerial in 2 months, we still have not discussed WTO reform. We're talking about negotiations on fisheries subsidies, we're talking about negotiations on e-commerce, but we're not talking about the systemic failures that make the WTO function. Sorry, this is a long answer to your short question about whether the WTO can. Yes. Why? Because A, there is no leadership. B, there is a big challenge of the increasing complexity of trade policy issues, as we have seen from our discussion over the past hour and a half. And C, well, you need to mobilize the political will and the common purpose behind the system and say, do you want a system? This is the reality that governments would need to face. The Saudi presidency last year produced the Riyadh Initiative on the reform of WTO, which was an agreement among 20 countries in the G20 on certain basic elements of what WTO reform should be about. Where is that now? So back to political will, I'm sorry to come back to the same point. Governments need to focus. And that brings me to the most important point, I think, that I would like to make here now, which is the voice of the private sector and organizations like yours. This is where the governments actually would get, sorry to use the word, I don't mean to be patronizing, but this is where governments get educated. This is where politicians get educated about the realities of doing business on the ground. Because all what we hear is objectives and shiny words, but how do you get that done? Whether it's about job creation or raising the standard of living or increasing exports, or don't talk to me about objectives. Don't talk to me about the what. Could you please talk to me about the how? Because this is what policies and regulations are about. So this is what is missing. Is this going to give wider space to regional agreements? Yes. But the proliferation of regional agreements becomes a result, not a cause, for the weakness of the WTO. So this is the picture as I see it. But again, these are my own views. I have the luxury now of not being affiliated to any organization, so I don't need to be politically correct. But thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you, sir. Roberto, would you like to add on to the gentleman's questions from your side, please?
Sure. I fully agree with everything that Hamid said. I would like to go even one step further. How can we make a change in a particular country? I think that based on my own experience, I'm going to talk not as a World Bank, but as a former government official. Governments today, the most pressing need for any politician today is to show that is creating jobs. Is that every successful politician everywhere has to, it would be a good politician if they can show that they're creating jobs. Now, what I'm saying this, because who are the ones creating the jobs? You, not the politician. You are the ones that create the jobs. So my experience, I think, in many countries that we are working on how the political economy of making things happen have a lot to do of how the private sector wisely organizes itself to basically make the politician understand that it's in the best interest of the politician to listen to you. You mentioned tax. Tax is one of the most pressing problems worldwide. The reason why it's not mentioned is because in the FTA with the US, tax is not regulated. I mean, it's not it's not covered by the Trade and Services Agreement per se, right? Indirectly, yes. If there's discrimination, if there are caps, then there might be. But it's a topic that usually goes beyond trade. However, the tax burden is absolutely critical. I don't want to ignore it. But at the end of the day, the question is, okay, how can you make as private sector have a dialogue that is more institutionalized, more systematic, more based on KPIs, as you said, and make governments or policy officers understand that it's in your best interest to have you succeed, because you are the ones who will generate the jobs. That's part of the project that the World Bank will going to implement. But let me tell you, my key experience here, there are two questions, two aspects. One is organization, right? And the more organized the private sector is, and by organized, I don't mean to have access, because you already have access to the political authorities. I think that's not the point. When I say organization is go with a concrete agenda and propose KPIs and propose sectors and propose not a dialogue that is all encompassing and is no, sector by sector. What is the problem? What can the ICT in back office services need? What is the cultural services? What is the engineering services? Propose kind of a sector based dialogue, and then measure. And then with that, that's part of the project of the World Bank wants to do. We want to help governments measure performance. Why? Because if we measure performance, and if we get something good, the politician will be interested in showing that off. Now, the last point I want to stress, and I think you already mentioned it, is that this cannot be closed doors. This has to be public. So the press is absolutely crucial here. In my experience in my own country, we managed to do a lot of reforms because the economic press was hand in hand with government and private sector, witnessing everything that was happening, generating pressure, and of course, using the FTAs as well. Remember that this FTA brings you the US into the table, right? You have the interest of the US here as well. And that is a formidable pressure for governments. And the celebration of the 20th anniversary of this FTA gives you the perfect excuse to revitalize the FTA, to relaunch it, to talk about it, to organize in very detailed things and come back and say, well, what is success? Let's define success. For us, success is, and put KPIs and make the government do that. And then if you have the press and then you file the follow-up, then the chances for reform will increase. The advertisement that I can tell you is that we're going to launch this project with the Jordanian government. I think the government wants also success. Everybody wants success. The question is how, right? And I think we have to keep mapping who are the reform champions within the government with names. And that information is key for us as World Bank to help you to operationalize this, right? And the World Bank can serve as an honest broker here because we're not the government, we're not the private sector. Our interest is development. And so feel free to use it, to use us as much as you can. We will get in touch back with you when this project is launched. But let me tell you that the government is eager to launch it. So we will look forward to work with you on that.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you indeed. I have a question for Mr. Rubalcaba, but I wanted to ask you, Sir Luis, if you want to add on to what the gentleman said. If not, I'll go ahead with my question. And then from there, we move on to a question by Mr. Mohammed Takatka, who has his hand up. So, sir, if you please go ahead.
May I just one small sentence to Mr. Roberto. Actually, what the public-private dialogue, what happened and what was supported from the USAID, we went through the whole sectors. It wasn't only one, okay? So we went to the agriculture, water, FDI, capital market, unemployment. It was with the 6-7 dimensions actually in the economy. The idea here, it was very clear. You know, when we tackled each point or each sector, there was a lot of recommendations coming from these PPDs, but it was never announced. So now the idea, even if, what about the press and even USAID, who supported this project, and the government, nobody is speaking about it. Who will speak? Do you want me to create a press to announce these things? It will be really, for us as a private, we want this result to show up to the public. But we are not a government in the end of the day, and we cannot have this influence in the press or whatever.
Okay.
So we are facing a big problem with this thing, you know. We know that there is a lot of, you know, good things came up from the private-public dialogue since we tackled every point, you know. But what was the result? If we keep hiding these results, there will be no improvement. If we push it more, and we are using some, you know, some even like, you know, some LinkedIn, you know, we spoke about these things, but also not.
Absolutely, point taken. We're approaching the end of the session, so thank you, sir. Let me pose a question to Mr. Rubalcaba, and if I may, sir, my question is the following: is how can we open up and develop the services industry to help bolster jobs for women, which is a very, you know, interesting topic that we at AmCham are taking it very seriously and really giving it all our efforts. And of course, this issue is a hot topic that is really being also an interest of many countries. So basically, how important is it to have strong services data locally and trade data? And what can Jordan do to enhance services data given its importance for the economy? Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to say that just that they are just to support a little bit what was said before about the alignment, the necessary alignment between a private sector and government. That is, when I looking at the countries that have been more successful in turning from negative deficit in the balance of services and turn into positive surpluses in the balance of services. Some of the examples, when I see both in Europe and in developing economies, have some same coincidences. One is the necessary alignment between public-private sector and government. Another one is that we have been talking a lot about the complementarities between FDI and international trade. But I would like to mention also the importance of focusing on mode 4 of international. So the mobility of people, because at the end of the day, services is a lot about people, about workers that may have the possibility of moving around. And this issue that I see in the chat, that there is Salem Muhusa saying that I believe that in Jordan we have lack of expertise. So at the end of the day, those countries that have been able to really to increase a lot competitiveness in services is because they have bringing FDI and capital, but not only capital in terms of money, but capital mainly in terms of human capital of people, just showing others how to do things, bringing the most advanced knowledge from all different parts of the world. And this creates a kind of ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, when this knowledge is brought to a country, and then there is a dynamic that start to international trade and other modes of international competitiveness. So,
okay, go ahead, sir. My apologies. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I finish here. Yes, on data things. Well, and then so important. People are extremely important, and services are the key, really, are the essential. So the idea of having knowledge transfer between local providers, foreign providers, this is amazing how this is many times the outcome of FDI and integration and liberalization, certain things that are really delivering this further integration between local and foreign providers. This really create huge synergies, boosting further FDI and further international trade. And this is also a way also to bring women in the labor force for providing services. This is the best, in fact, the best way, because sometimes some local structures have difficulties, but then when you have foreign providers, this create a lot of new alternatives for different kind of jobs, from male and for women. And then on data and statistics, yes, I think data is particularly important. For example, how difficult it is to get data on FDI in services, in particular services. So I present you data on international trade, but this is it's very difficult to get really good data on FDI per branch, per services branch. So there are a lot of things that are really necessary to work with, and it's important that the balance of payment data that are traditional source, statistical source for analyzing services trade should be complemented by other sources. For example, the projects now data on foreign affiliates that generate business, generate exports, generate things. This kind of data are also very important in the line that Roberto was saying before about the importance of foreign companies working in the country. No? So I think there is a much more ambitious progress also from the statistical point of view, in order that policymakers and stakeholders can take wise decisions. Because then if you can show that you are doing well in certain areas with the data, then you can get more attractiveness for also for investors and from further doing business.
Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it, Professor. We have two people and we have 2 minutes. So if I may start with Mohammed Takatka, please, just for his question, and then we'll give our own Lana Nimri. I see her hand up as well. I don't know if you have, or you have it down now. Okay. So now we just have Mohammed Takatka and then closing remarks. Mohammed, go ahead, please.
Thank you all for this event, and I appreciate all the participants' papers and what they spoke about, and I really like it. And I totally agree about that we need to enhance and to, after 20 years of the agreement, to go step forward, and totally agree about the lobbying or pushing or start moving between private and public sector. Sorry if first of all I did not introduce myself. I am Advocate Mohammed Takatka. I'm a head legal counsel for Jordan Chamber of Industry and managing partner for At-Tafahum law firm, and lately Poultry and Feeds Investors Association. I am the board advisor for them for governmental, legal and mediation. So I totally agree, as I stopped, that we need to go for step forward in this issue, and the private sector should lead the whole process. According to my position from Jordan Chamber of Industry, I would highly appreciate that we start doing some roundtable or brainstorming together with AmCham. And according to conclusions of that, we can go for the government to ask what we want, because most probably, or most of the time, the government did not have the idea about all the requirements that the private sector is needed for. So I highly welcome and call from this time to we can prepare something like that to start ruling the issues from the ground to the top. Thank you for this event, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I believe that Mr. Eshendi had to leave us, so I want to thank him very much for his participation. I also understand that Rose had her hand up. She wanted to say a couple of words, so let's leave it our very vibrant and hardworking CEO. Rose, go ahead, ma'am.
Actually, I didn't have my hand up, but I would love to just say a couple of words at the end to thank our wonderful speakers. This is such an important topic, and I'm happy that everybody recognizes the role of AmCham Jordan to be the public-private dialogue platform for us to continue the discussion and conversation to come up with private sector-led recommendations to the government. I want to recognize the role of Lana Nimri, Head of Public Policy Advocacy and FTA, in putting this together, the speakers for putting all the time and effort, USAID project, MEG project, powered by Pragma, if we may say, and of course our chairman who did a wonderful job in moderating this session. We thank you all for your kind support, and we hope to see you in the upcoming sessions as a follow-up to this important event. Thank you.
Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.